Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and some time ago I actually got access to Mists of Pandaria beta, though at the time I didn't really have a lot of good opportunities to actually hop on and play around on it for even a little bit, up until recently, and man did I miss Pandaria. As an expansion, it's absolutely gorgeous. The zones, the music, everything around the environment and the aesthetics. Many players to this day hold Pandaria in the highest of regards. There's a reason why it was as popular as it was when we had MoP Remix, why so many players jumped back into Pandaria to re-experience all of its content all over again. One of the core components that made Pandaria stand out from every other expansion alone was its class design, and it was excellent. So many players have good memories of Pandaria abilities and talents and the way that their classes will play in raids, dungeons, or PvP. And for PvPers in particular, this might actually be their best expansion when it comes to overall WoW PvP, at least when you look at it from back in the day. The sad part is, however, some of these favorite playstyles that players remember fondly actually were alive and existent only during Pandaria, and they were gone for Warlords General and every other expansion since, so this could be an opportunity to experience some of the most fun class design you've ever seen. And I wanted to really highlight the class design that really does only live within Pandaria, specifically talking about abilities and talents and utility that classes brought in that only existed for MoP, in case you're looking for a fun class to pick up for yet another classic expansion. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for World of Warcraft in general, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Now, the first class on this list that I just had to check out immediately was the class of Priest, because there's one little talent that all three specs had access to that has been missed greatly ever since they removed it, and I'm pretty sure the talent got removed after Mists of Pandaria. So this is like your only chance to ever even experience it. However, quick note on the talent tree, I actually thought I missed talent tree from Pandaria. I didn't. Definitely feels like outdated design. I'm a big fan of a big talent tree with a lot of points for you to put into, whether you're talking about a classic WoW design or even retail version from War Within. Having a big talent tree with a lot of options, I prefer that so much more than this condensed version we got in Pandaria, though some of the cool abilities that we'll talk about in this video do come from this Pandaria talent tree though. For Priest, however, in the bottom row, there's only one good option that I think everybody should play, and that is Cascade. This is the first ability that I want to highlight because this button right here really was the creme de la creme when it comes to Priest. At least I personally remember it very, very fondly. If you're ever fighting in a situation where there's multiple enemies to fight as a shadow or multiple allies to heal as holy or discipline, this was the perfect button for that AoE healing, as it kind of fits right in between a Divine Star, which has a little bit of this like frontal projectile, maybe some single target damage, very short cooldown, or Halo, which is a way longer cooldown, hits everything in AoE, has a bit more impact but not able to be used as regularly. Cascade had the best of both worlds. Wasn't quite as long of a cooldown as Halo, but wasn't quite as short as Divine Star. And what it did is I guess she just showed off, it sent out a bolt that did this unique thing where depending if you're a healer or DPS, it actually did some splitting mechanics. So you send out a bolt as a shadow, it splits into two bolts, that splits into two more bolts, and they just bounce everywhere on all the targets, doing significant amounts of damage. And it was so good for Holy, and this was a little bit more of a healing component, but it did have some damage components with it as well. So like if you were trying out to play like a Holy Chakram DPS playstyle, which was also kind of fun, very unique build for Pandaria, but this definitely was like one of those exciting buttons that just did so much damage from back in the day for Priest, and it feels so good to use because it's instant cast. It has a smart healing, smart damage component, as it'll seek out fresh new targets, it'll do some hybrid healing if at all possible, if necessary, but it'll just, I love the whole splitting thing that it does. It looks so good, and it hits very hard. Definitely one of those exciting buttons that is worth coming back to just for Mists of Pandaria beta, just because you're never going to be able to play with this button again. They added it from MoP, and I'm pretty sure they removed it at least by Shadowlands. I know it was gone. I'm pretty sure it was also gone back in Warlords General too, so definitely it's one of those awesome buttons that was very short-lived. Another class worth highlighting is the Mage, and Mage actually, just as a class, had a number of buttons that a lot of people still fondly remember. And while Mage, like some of these other classes, doesn't have a specific button that I could point to that really made the class awesome, the general presence and the design of mages, whether you're Fire, Frost, or Arcane, from Pandaria was excellent. The amount of tools you had was amazing. Your choices between talents actually gave some nice and interesting, compelling options. Maybe like not Rune of Power, that was not really all that fun, but so many other buttons that you had available in Pandaria really did help elevate the class of Mage for the general gameplay in the entire expansion. But if I had to name a number of buttons that I really did miss, one would be the Mr. Pandaria version of Alter Time. Previously, the ability was a 3-minute cooldown, so it was quite hefty. Not only did it reset your character back with your original health, so it could be used defensively, kind of like how it gets to use now, but also it did a couple of cool things, like it would remember what buffs, what procs, what abilities you had access to, what effects you had access to at the time, basically use Alter Time to regain those effects all over again, result in some incredibly strong burst damage. So if let's say I were to get a couple of procs on the Mage, maybe throw down a Frost Bomb as well as a Frozen Orb, get a couple of proxy, maybe a couple of lances, a couple of brain freezes, and then I pop all cooldowns, you could Alter Time, set all of those procs at the target, then Alter Time to regain those procs all over again. It was actually so wild that the class could do that, and if you could time it at a right moment, get a bunch of procs as Arcane, Fire, or Frost, it was a ton of fun back in the day. And also allowed for excellent use of skill expression, which I think was a really big highlight for mages back in the day. Mages also had access to other fun abilities like a deep freeze. As long as the target was frozen or treated as frozen in the case of Frost, you could actually stun a target which would treat them as they are frozen, allowing shatter components which were available for Frost, Arcane, and Fire to amplify their damage greatly, especially in content like PvP. And you also had unique utility buttons like Frostjaw, which was a silence effect with a root that allowed you to maybe follow up a full silence into a target, then into a stun. It was definitely one of those unique buttons that mages had that eventually just disappeared out of the game. I think Pandaria mages were basically just full of surprises with so many cool talents and abilities that were generally unique for their class that over time got really stripped out. So if you ever wanted to play Mage at its peak, I feel like Pandaria version of Mages is definitely one of the biggest highlights of this class in this game's history. Another class that I think is worth highlighting is the Warrior, though not necessarily for their damage, though I did primarily play Warrior as a Fury or Arms, not really much as Prot, but the Warrior in general in Pandaria, their design was very interesting, especially if you're someone who's, let's say, been playing retail, like War Within, whether Season 1 or Season 2. Maybe you found yourself feeling like Warriors just don't have that much utility. And maybe it made you wonder, just how much utility did Warriors lose over the past few expansions? Have Warriors always been just like this lone wolf type of a class that doesn't really bring much to a group? I mean, there's things like Rally, there's things like Commanding Shout, raid buffs. Pandaria, literally every class had a raid buff of some sort or another. But Warriors in particular were just filled with utility. And it's actually kind of overwhelming just how much stuff they brought to a group. Starting with mechanics such as banners, which was a unique bit of mechanics that doesn't exist anymore, but war banners were banners that you would throw down and they would have different effects that affected you, your party, or even the enemy team instead. You have banners like Mocking Banner, where you would throw it down, enemies that stand next to the banner are automatically attracted to the warrior. So if you were a tank, you would drop down a Mocking Banner and it would make it easier for you to hold aggro against enemies in the dungeon, for instance, so you could easily make sure that all the aggro and threat goes to you specifically. Demoralizing Banner was another banner that would literally demoralize all enemies around you. Like, you would drop down the banner and it would reduce enemies' damage done by 10% for 15 seconds. Nothing crazy, but imagine you're in a dungeon or in a raid, your raid team is about to get hit by a big mechanic, you drop down the banner and now everybody takes a little bit less damage. Talk about that grade-wide utility. And then we have the big one, which is Skull Banner, which would actually buff up your entire raid or party. Drop down the banner to increase the critical strike damage of your party and raid members within 40 yards by 20%. 20% more crit strike damage, lasts for 40 seconds. Plus, Warriors had a little bit of this core interaction with things like Recklessness, so they could always guarantee some crits, and they did more damage. But if everybody else had a bit of crit, or even just some of their abilities crit, those crits hit harder. And this was applied for everybody in your group for 10 seconds. It is massive. Outside of this, the Warriors also have access to shouts, like a root shout or a slow shout, which are all normal. but they also at some point had a disrupted shout that would interrupt enemies for 4 seconds within a 10-yard range. An AoE interrupt, essentially an AoE pummel, which was massive. Warriors could technically pick up a disrupting shout only as protection, but they have to give up a challenging shout, which is how they get aggro to them, but they can then use it in order to silence enemies while also drawing aggro, and that's like the only way the Warriors can get it. Or you can just play Pandaria Arms and Fury and pick up Disrupting Shout to get some AoE caster protection. And we got level Robe 75, which is just fully utility. Mass Spell Reflection to pop Spell Reflect on all of your allies for, once a minute is massive. Not only can this be used to reflect boss abilities or even dungeon enemy abilities, but also PvP abilities. It can prevent your hunter from being ran over by a big old Chaos Bolt from a Warlock, or potentially can interrupt a mage from being able to polymorph your healer. The amount of utility that it offers within different forms of endgame is massive. Vigilance, just by looking at an ally, you reduce their damage taken by 30% for 12 seconds just for staring at them. Other classes need to use Blessing of Sacrifice where they share some damage, or they use a 5-minute cooldown in order to reduce it. Warriors could just look at a guy and be like, you're all good, and they ain't dying for at least 12 seconds while Vigilance is on them. Even Safeguard allows you to intercept towards an ally, reducing their damage taken, and parts of this are available in War Within through hero talents. Like, a version of Safeguard is technically in the game, but this was like a way better version back then too, that allowed your allies to get a little bit extra damage protection. And I mean, the amount of utility a warrior brought to a group content was massive in Pandaria, way more than many players could have expected. And I mean, the amount of utility this class brings in general in MoP actually is just staggering. Just look at the talents and look at the abilities. It is crazy just how useful in a group they can be, just from some of the base skills that they can bring to their team. Another spec that's worth highlighting is the Monk. Oh, I guess the class of the Monk, but specifically I wanted to focus on the spec of the Mistweaver, because Mistweavers have 2 unique playstyles in Pandaria, and part of the playstyle kind of bleeds into like the retail version of WoW, the War Within version, where you have the Castweaver, which heals from range, or a Fistweaver, which heals by dealing damage. Though both of those playstyles are a healing spec, though one does a little bit more damage, a little bit better in Mythic Pluses, or if you can stay in melee over target pretty regularly. But primarily, both of those blend together into a healing build. You're primarily a healer with some damage on the side. Mr. Pandaria really flipped it on its head, because Castweaver, the proper healing build of Monk, and the Fistweaver were entirely different. Fistweaver actually was a significant change in your priority as well as your rotation as a Monk back in MoP. Like, you were primarily a damage dealer with healing on a side, and you did significant damage, allowing you to push damage output in a raid or a dungeon to much greater heights than most healers could bring. You were a damage monk primarily with some healing on a side. That's so significant and impactful going into a proper fist weaving playstyle was back in MoP. But if you wanted to have a proper healing build, you would revert from a range healer and heal from a distance and properly keep everybody alive. You wouldn't really get up in melee and start meleeing unless there's like a lot of downtime and there's nothing really going on. And that's the biggest difference in Pandaria, is the significant changes and the differences between the two. Fistweavers were actually very strong, competitive in PvP, high amount of damage in dungeons, huge damage in raids. You sacrificed healing to some degree, but you brought in great damage while keeping the cooldowns of a Mistweaver. It was definitely a unique playstyle that is renowned and favored by so many monks that played back then. And if you ever want to play like a really aggressive healer, very high damage output, I think Mistweaver might be one of those unique options that gives you so many different playstyles. A proper healer or a damage healer, which can potentially satisfy your ability to play any role in any type of content. Now, another spec that I think is definitely worth highlighting is Enhancement Shaman, which were solid. Most people will call them like an A-tier competitive option for Pandaria all throughout that entire expansion. Being a shaman, you also brought in a ton of utility, from Bloodlust to a number of different totems that were good for a variety of different situations, with many different uses all throughout endgame content. What is fun about Enhancement in particular is actually a very unique build that it had for a very short time, very short-lived, mostly throughout the entirety of expansion of Pandaria, and then get removed out of the game completely. You see, Enhancement normally is a dual-wielded class, wielding a weapon in each hand, so you can Storm Strike with your main hand, or I guess both of your weapons technically, and then Lava Lash with your offhand. And both of those main hand, offhand attacks use so many different of your passives and procs in order to generate significant damage. However, Shamans were not really restricted to weapons, and technically, while they were a dual-wield class wielding a weapon in each hand, they could go for a two-handed playstyle. A playstyle that found very niche uses, primarily in PvP, if you're a big fan of literal one-shots obliterating other players within a single press of a button. Those playstyles technically were viable all throughout Pandaria, and continued to be somewhat viable heading into MoP Classic. There was a fun little build that I wanted to try to see if it still works, but if you press the ability of Ascendance, it transforms your Storm Strike into this great empowered Wind Strike ability that hits enemies from a distance. And because of the two-handed scaling for Storm Strike causing the ability to deal much more damage, that also empowered the damage of that Ascendance greatly. Together with a couple of buffs like Elemental Mastery, as well as all the haste procs and trinkets, this could give you the most amount of damage that could be followed up with an Elemental Blast right afterwards, where that Storm Strike would actually cause your Elemental Blast to be more likely to crit on a target. And if you could chain 2 crits back to back into a foe, then the enemies could literally blow up in literally 2 globals. It was a very unique playstyle that wasn't really considered viable, but technically playable in some content. And if you're a fan of playing a class through multiple different ways, I feel like Enhancement Shaman is definitely one of those that needs to be experienced, especially if you're someone who enjoys a little bit of PvP and a little bit of being able to walk up and just blow up and burst somebody down really quickly. Not the strongest playstyle ever, but definitely one that was a ton of fun and definitely worth reliving if you do end up playing in MoP Classic. Now, the final class, as well as the ability worth highlighting, is Symbiosis. You knew I was going to mention Symbiosis at some point just because it was such a unique ability for Mists of Pandaria. Probably the most unique ability they've ever created, ever. Like, Symbiosis was so good for Pandaria that they immediately removed it for the next expansion. And they never thought about bringing this ability again just because the design behind it was insane. Basically, what Symbiosis will do, it would allow a druid to link up with another player. You would be able to then share an ability between your classes. Like, they would be able to get one of druid abilities modified for their playstyle to them, and you'll be able to get one of their skills granted, and you'll be able to kind of like trade, not necessarily lose an ability, but like share an ability between one and the other. And this effect will persist for an hour. And the amount of abilities, the list of them is actually pretty big. Death Knights could get this wild mushroom, though instead of spreading like nature damage, it would spread plagues instead. Hunters got dash. Monks like Brewmaster got survival instincts. Paladins got bark skin. Priests got Cyclone, which is actually pretty good in PvP. Shamans got Solar Beam to silence enemy targets, and Warriors get Stampeding Shout. So not only do Warriors already have a bunch of utility for Pandaria, but now they can get like their own version of a Stampeding Roar, but in a shout format that they can use to increase the movement speed of all other allies. And you can just imagine the amount of utilitarian aspects can be used with all those classes getting those abilities. But druids, the abilities they would get were even more unique because they were different depending if you're Balance, Feral, Guardian, Restoration, and every single spec or druid got a different ability from all the different classes. Balance druids got strong defenses like Cloak of Shadows, Anti-Magic Shell, and even things like Mass Dispel and Hammer of Justice. Feral druids got things like Divine Shield or Dispersion defensively, or Feral Spirits if they linked with a Shaman, Soul Swap with a Warlock which allowed him to transfer the bleeds from one target to another. Guardian druids got mostly defensive type of abilities like Spell Reflection from Warriors, Consecration from Paladins, and Restoration druid got major big defenses from Deterrence or Ice Block or even Evasion from Rogues. And if they linked up to a Warlock, they would get Demonic Circle Teleport, and they could teleport to the Warlock's Demonic Circle. So Warlock would set it up and a druid could just port to it immediately. And you can only imagine how this ability alone could just give druids, as well as another class, so much utility within dungeons or even raids or PvP content. The amount of defensives or offensive abilities you would be able to gain from one another was crazy. The amount of utility you were able to bring to an entire group was massive. And it was one of those abilities that kind of encourage druids to pair up with classes that are not druids to really get a lot of this group variety into your group, so you could switch around with different abilities depending on a fight or if an encounter needed one ability or another. And it's just kind of crazy. The actual symbiosis ability is as exciting to play with right now on the beta as it was back in the day. Because it's such a short-lived ability that only existed in Pandaria. Like, if you pick up any class from MoP Beta or even MoP Classic, if you are going to be playing MoP Classic, Druid, I think, has to be on that list in the top 3 at the very bare minimum. You have to give somebody else a go. It's super fun. And while I think Druid talent tree in general was just not my favorite, like the amount of options you have in the talent tree just isn't that great in my opinion. Symbiosis I think helps makes up for all that to some degree, just with the amount of utility that you're able to set up depending which class you symbiosis with. And it's super fun and can even allow for some very interesting plays just by using that ability with any different classes. But with that, as always, I don't want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community, especially if you're looking to keep up with any Season 2 War Within updates, or if you just want to find out what server I'm going to be playing on for Classic. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.